Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And thank you, members, for your attention. And thank you, Mr. Smith, for wiping things down and helping us to maintain clean premises here. I do appreciate that. I want to address three things here. And I want to lead by saying that in the last version of this, as you know, I voted for the House version, the House proposal on the continuing resolution. There were several reasons for that. One is that it did make provision for furloughs to happen should revenues continue to decline like it appeared that they may. Another reason was that, we were operating under a limited amount of data in terms of what was yet to come. And that certainly included in terms of how bad the economic situation was going to prove to be as a result of these shutdowns. And then also I supported the last CR because I felt like a lot of the resources, the emergency resources, were being devoted to testing. Now, what's changed since then? What's changed since the last time we were in this chamber? Well, one thing that we've seen is that the governor certainly has been slow, you might say cautious, about reopening, but that is happening. We've seen a new focus emerge, less of a focus on, DHEC will say the focus on testing is there, and they want to, broaden the testing, and that's a good thing. But a new focus in the middle of that plan is contact tracing, as has already been brought up a couple of times. And then finally, the third thing that has changed is that the unemployment numbers are severe. Over 20 million people nationwide have lost their jobs. Those are just the ones that we know about. That alone is more than 14% unemployment rate in the nation. It has already exceeded, in just a few short weeks' time, anything that happened during the Great Recession. And we're still, new numbers are still coming in every day. This is a fluid situation, and that doesn't necessarily even account for everyone that has lost their jobs that have not applied for unemployment or who haven't been able to get their application processed because the logs or the phone lines, the computer systems are so clogged. I've had to help many constituents over the past several weeks work through situations where they had gotten in their application back in March, and it'd been sitting there in a pending status. And these people, one gentleman, bless his heart, had stage 4 cancer and no insurance. I can tell you that thankfully we do have some responsive staff over at DEW that have been very helpful in working through many of these issues. But I only bring that up to point out just how badly people are suffering in South Carolina, and I fear that it's only going to get worse. I want to remind us that this CR is based on last year's budget. With a few straightforward modifications, it is essentially the same as last year's budget. I want to remind you that the total for last year's budget was a whopping $29.5 billion. $8.7 billion of that was general funds. Why are we using that as the basis? Why not the budget before that, which was approximately $5 billion smaller? Why not go all the way back to the last Great Recession budget, adjust for inflation, and use that as a basis? Are we attempting to let history be our guide here? South Carolina, this legislature, many of you here, I wasn't here during the Great Recession. I wasn't in the legislature, wasn't part of this body, but some of you were. And you saw firsthand what that was like to have to come back and make steep cuts. So, as I raised the question earlier, when we're talking about which businesses are essential versus non-essential and which businesses can operate without posing great health risks, and we're now allowing some of those to start to reopen, which state agencies we should be asking can operate without posing a serious risk to the funds that the taxpayers give us, which are going to run out, let me tell you. The longer we go, the more I believe, the more we're going to see those numbers drop. That's been the pattern so far. Some would even argue that the more than 14% nationwide unemployment rate is grossly underestimated, that the true rate could be in the mid-20s or even as high as 30%. If that's true, folks, we need to face the fact and confront the reality that if that's true, those are Great Depression level numbers. We're already approaching that. If 14% is the right number, we're very close to that. Because from 1931 to 1940, unemployment was in the high teens. We're only a couple of points away from being at that level right now. Now, what we don't know is if this is going to be a spike and it's going to come back down and the economy is going to begin to recover, or if this is going to be a prolonged situation or a new normal, as some like to use that term. So, which budget should we use as a basis for this? I'm not sure that the last year's budget is the best budget that we should be using. I want to point out two specific examples of what I'm talking about. Tuition mitigation. In an attempt to curb higher tuition, this legislature, this body, with the governor's advocacy as well, the last couple of years has given additional money to state universities in exchange for an agreement that they would not continue to raise tuition on in-state students. This CR suspends proviso or strikes proviso 117.155 from last year's budget, which are the strings, right? Which are the strings. Those are the strings. Those were not the tuition mitigation funds. Those were saying that the funds have been allocated in these amounts, and in exchange for those funds, orders colleges and universities not to raise tuition. In other words, by removing proviso 117.155 from this CR, we are removing those strings, but we're not removing the funding. So at this point, colleges and universities will be free to raise tuition if they choose. Now, some have voluntarily stated their intent not to do so. But we are giving them that permission by striking that proviso from this CR. Now, if there were one thing in this entire last year's budget that we could say is non-essential, I would suggest to you that it is that. Now, on the other hand, what is something that is essential? If you put yourself in the shoes of the average taxpayer that has to drive on our roads to go to work or to visit family or to go to the doctor or to go get tested or to go get medicine, you have to drive on roads which are in the worst shape that I have ever seen as long as I've been living in South Carolina. Meanwhile, we're in prime road fixing season, weather-wise, and I don't recall seeing the first SCDOT employee out working. I've seen some local activity, but that's coming from our county roads and bridges, and my hat's off to them. Why are we not taking advantage of decreased traffic during the midst of this shutdown to go out and fix our roads? Let me ask you another question. Are we paying our contractors? It wasn't so very long ago that we didn't pay our DOT contractors. Are we repeating that now because the employees required to push the paperwork to make sure that contractors get employed have been sent home? And meanwhile, they're still making a paycheck. I call on Secretary Hall to address these issues and to make sure that we're not missing opportunities to fix our roads with the money we already have sitting in the bank right now. Now, I want to finally talk about contact tracing, which has been touched on a couple of times here, and I appreciate my colleagues raising questions. But I've also heard some erroneous information given out suggesting that this is not China, that DHEC isn't going to come busting down your door. And folks, I would beg to differ. I would ask, have you read Title 44, Chapter 4, the emergency health powers in our state code? Have you read that? Do you realize that when you sit down and you compare that to Title 44, Chapter 17, the mental health involuntary commitment statutes, that the due process protections for quarantine situations in voluntary quarantine situations is almost non-existent. And one could argue, based on some of the wording, that it is non-existent during a state of health emergency as declared by the governor.
Mr. Hill, your time's expired on the amendment.
I would like to request my second 10 minutes.
Recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Let me know when you'll take questions, Mr. Hill.
One can argue, based on the wording in Title 44, Chapter 4, that the due process that exists, which is more after the fact than beforehand, is suspended during a state of health emergency ordered by the governor. Now, we haven't seen any abuses from DHEC so far on this. And I'm bringing this up because this CR proposal includes instructions to DHEC to hire at least 1,000 contact tracers. I have a number of issues with this and a number of questions. First and foremost of which, why is this even in here when just yesterday they told us they'd already done this? They're saying they've identified 1,800 contact tracers. So why is the legislature ordering them to do something that they've already done? Another question I would ask is, are you not concerned over the civil liberties implications of giving DHEC certain information that perhaps you are not sick, but you have been in contact or might have been in contact with someone who at some point down the road tested positive, and a contact tracer traces that back to you or your constituent, and some contact tracer decides that it's in the public health interest, or some official at DHEC decides it's in the public health interest that you quarantine. And they first put it to you as a recommendation. We recommend you voluntarily quarantine for 14 days. Well, let's say that's difficult for you to do, maybe even impossible, for a variety of legitimate reasons. And you say, I'm sorry, I can't do that, or I won't do that. DHEC has the authority to come and impose a mandatory quarantine at a location of their choosing for 14 days. Actually, I take that back. Under the statute, there is no time limit imposed. They can decide what that time limit is. And that time limit can even extend beyond the state of emergency. Whenever the governor's orders do expire, DHEC, it still gets to decide when your personal quarantine ends. Let me ask you this too. What about these contact tracers? Are they going to be required under state law to be mandatory reporters? In other words, if a contact tracer does reach out to you and they decide you're being less than cooperative and you have 3 kids in the home, despite the fact that not one single person in this household is sick or has tested positive for COVID-19, DHEC would have the power and the knowledge at that point to impose a quarantine, to remove the kids from that home by working with DSS under the accusation of medical neglect. Now, again, I want to reiterate that none of this has as of yet happened. But I would also point out that as far as I know, not a lot of contact tracing, if any, related specifically to COVID-19 has as of yet happened. And so I'm telling you folks, the setup is bad. And if you care about your constituents' civil liberties, and if you care about your constituents' health, and if you care about your constituents' livelihoods, you cannot vote for this setup. There's still time to work something out. We're going to be here. If we vote this down today, we have other means at our disposal, and we're not even going home. We're going to be here this week. So let's get this right. And let's work with our colleagues over in the Senate to get this right, because people's lives and livelihoods are important. And we signed up for the job. We asked for the job. We put our hands on the Bible, and we swore an oath to protect and defend the Constitution of the United States and of this state. There aren't many of us, there are a few of us, there aren't many of us who have been pointing out the constitutional ramifications and the lack of constitutional authorization for any of these, including the Health Powers Acts in Title 44, Chapter 4. There's very little in the Constitution that gives the legislature the authority to even enact that to begin with, much less for the governor to, by fiat and stroke of his pen, by executive order, to enact this stuff. So I'm concerned. And I hope you'll consider these things carefully. I'm not going to belabor the point by standing up here and taking questions. If anybody wants to know what basis or what evidence I have for what I'm saying, I'm happy to share it. I'll be over here at my desk, and I appreciate your indulgence.